New legislation aims to check major technology companies and prevent them from building, quote, addictive features into their products. The bill was introduced by Senator Josh Hawley from Missouri. In an op-ed in USA Today, he calls platforms like Facebook a digital drug that, like other drugs, can hurt users. But not everyone is on board. Some have called Senator Hawley's plan to combat social media addiction, quote, super duper dumb. Joining us to give his take on the bill's associate editor at Reason, Robbie Suave. He's the author of Panic Attack, Young Radicals in the Age of Trump. Robbie, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome. Glad to be here.
So, Robbie, I mean, the reason I asked you on is you were one of the most, I think, vociferous critics online, among many others, really embodied by the libertarian set against this. So I think I would like to get into what is it about the bill or the idea of government trying to stop social media addiction or phone addiction so objectionable to you?
I mean, this is nanny state kind of stuff to me. The science on social media addiction is far from settled. It is way too early to say this is warping people's brains in an addictive way, the same way like cigarettes or something do. I mean, as a libertarian, even some of those regulations I oppose, so I would certainly oppose this very early attempt to really squelch new technology that maybe some people use irresponsibly, but a lot of other people use it, many people use it perfectly responsibly. It actually improves their lives. And I don't want to give the government this much power to regulate these kinds of things, again, with so little actual consensus that there's a real harm here.
Okay. But we do have science on synapses and screen time and so on and so forth, right? I mean, so the science of social media addiction and specific to social media, of course, is not that developed. But we do have a lot of science out there on just general screen time, right?
There's some suggestion that too much of anything is a bad thing for young people, right? They need to get off their phones and get some actual sleep, and that's affecting their moods, I think. But, you know, they could stay up. In another era, they would have stayed up late reading comic books or listening to the radio or something. There's always a panic over the new thing. You know, there used to be a fear that it's promoting Satanism in kids if they're reading all this, you know, bad which always sounds ridiculous now, years later. I think we'll feel the same way about some of these early efforts to this panic over tech.
So I think you're correct that, you know, the burden of proof should be high. But I think what the difficulty here is like you said, I mean, you don't even think that there should be regulations on cigarettes. So it's like, where is it that the government should step in order to take a stand on something they think is a health problem? So, for example, I had the Surgeon General on this show. He talked about very concerning about screen time and about the brains of children who are overusing smartphones. I mean, at what level do you think that it could be something that we jump in for regulation? Because, I mean, you know, food, cheese, like very basic consumables, which is something that just like a smartphone is regulated by the government.
Well, but that's another thing, right? He's not, my understanding of Hawley's approach is he's not even this legislation is not specifically aimed at young people. It's for everyone.
It is aimed for everyone.
So if it's specifically a thing for young people, you would narrowly target it that way.
Would that change your position?
Probably not, but that would be a more defensible approach. I mean, he thinks he has just as much right to regulate, adults, people who may have to make responsible choices for themselves. And we're taking away, I mean, parents ultimately have to exercise more responsibility in their kids' lives, making them go to bed on time. Maybe we should start school later so the kids don't have to get up so early. So
the issue, I think,
that would be probably better.
That, you know, you have the world's greatest neuroscientists who are working in Silicon Valley. They used to be working in labs in order to create breakthrough technologies, and are now working to addict people to their phones. I mean, there's quite literally many of the things. I'm not saying, by the way, I support this bill. I think there are actually quite a bit of problems with infinite scroll and all that in terms of how it would affect business models. But I think it's more about, is it okay to have the brightest minds of your generation working to addict people to their phones? I mean, is that a good thing as a society?
When you put it like that, it sounds bad, but so efforts to regulate these companies or prevent them from doing this will disrupt their business models, make life more difficult for them. We're only seeing the negative of social media, and there are negatives. I'm not saying there's no negatives, but we tend to focus on the negatives. There are also positives to all these technologies that I can see what my friends and family are doing.
I can connect with you in an
instant. I can connect with people. You can connect with famous people, with significant people. As a journalist, I can interact with journalists more powerful and popular than me on Twitter. I mean, I'd have to write a letter to the editor in a different time.
Right. Josh Hawley has kind of gone on a anti-tech screed, if you will, with his legislative career in general. And full disclosure, he's a personal friend of mine. But as a libertarian, what does this portend for his kind of long-term political career? This is very nanny state stuff, right?
Yes.
And how does he square this?
Well, the reason I wanted Robbie on is because this is the central divide right now in the conservative movement, which is like you have the David French and Robbie and many other people at Reason who think that this is something that very much strays from the roots of conservatism. And Josh Hawley and I guess Trump and many others kind of embody a different approach. Yeah. So what is it, I think, about this? I guess where is it that the government should ever step in on things like this?
I mean, I may very well be in the minority among among the people we're talking about. It's certainly true that Hawley, to some extent, Trump are leading a more nationalist kind of movement that is not as in sync with the sort of the libertarian approach I take. I'm not an anarchist. I don't think there should be no government, no regulation, but I'm very reluctant to bring the government in to regulate a problem that we're still kind of debating what the ramifications are and how extensive the problem is. Cutting off technology too early is never a good thing.
Well, I thought it was interesting. I mean, I saw this exchange that you had with the author J.D. Vance where he talked about, if a 14-year-old wants to buy cigarettes and cocaine in his local Jiffy Mart, that's not something that policy should touch. Let's exercise some personal responsibility. You responded that actually describes your view. I give you a lot of credit.
On Twitter, man.
JD, I know JD accurately said. I mean, I respect you for saying that. I just thought it was interesting because I'm curious if it was ever a burden of proof that could rise, not just on social media, but for almost any product at that point, that you would be okay with government regulation.
Well, does the Constitution give the federal government the power to regulate these things is also another strict legal question that conservatives used to be very concerned about. Maybe some of these things should be handled at the state and local level. That would be defensible, but the federal government simply doesn't have this power. I mean, you're talking, with the social media company regulations, you're talking about something very close to speech.
Totally.
I mean, the First Amendment is the most powerful defense against government tyranny that a lot of, maybe not on the addiction front, but on some of Hawley's other stuff, his previous bill about the kind of content that.
Oh, we should talk about that. It's called Section 230.
Right.
So there's a big debate right now about whether these platforms can be qualified as platforms, which is FCC.
Platforms versus publishers.
Platform versus publishers, whether they're responsible for the content on their platforms or whether they're not.
Right.
And I know Reason has been very vocal about this. What is it, I guess, about the idea of why these companies, if they do decide to exercise political judgments and what type of speech that they're allowed on their platform, why shouldn't they be treated as publishers?
The law does treat them differently, right? And then the question is over whether it should. I think this is maybe a more legitimate area of debate because some people on the right are saying, well, they're getting a special benefit by having this protection that other publishers don't. But the law, it's that way because it just doesn't make sense to hold the entire company responsible for every comment that appears on its website. And if you changed the law the way Hawley wants to, this would not result in more conservative speech online, which I think is a very wrong-headed approach because you would make companies.
It would give them license to be like, okay, we're just going to.
You would make companies even more afraid of controversial speech than they already are, and that would result in more censorship of right-leaning speech. And also, the way Hawley structures that bill is it's setting up a government commission to decide, and you have to renew it every couple of years. And that starts to get into very dicey territory from a First Amendment perspective, saying that the government will have to decide based on the viewpoints being expressed by these various platforms versus publishers. Yeah. I mean, that could be a disaster. And I wouldn't want to give the government that power anyway. I think conservatives should think about whether they would want the government to have that power if it was an administration other than President Trump's. And I think they would come to a conclusion.
That's the fairest attack against it, which is what are you going to do when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is president?
Exactly. Right, and this kind of gets to what my concern is about Josh Hawley's political future in the Republican Party. It's this is not basic conservative fundamental bedrock stuff, So I wonder about what his long-term play here is politically.
What do you think, Robbie?
I think he is riding a wave that's headed in a specific direction toward this populism that is not again explicitly libertarian or individual rights or even free markets. I mean, there's a huge anti-free trade and anti-immigration wave. That's kind of where the movement is. So I actually think he's leading. I think it's going to continue in that direction for a while, which I don't like because it's moving away from what I kind of think. But I have to admit,
I just
when I'm
wonder
in
if
the
it's just kind of a
losing
fusion.
side.
It's a fusion of you trying to use the government for the loss of the communitarian institutions that we all used to have in our society. And so when you're a parent and you're working 2 jobs or whatever, you're a single parent, you just give your kid an iPad because it's the only thing that will actually get him to be quiet and maybe focus on something else. And you're up against multi-billion-dollar companies with neuroscientists who know how to make your kids' synapses fire.
Yeah, you can't win that.
That seems like something that you just can't win. So what force is big enough in order to make it so that you can do something about it?
Well, I don't know that it's always a negative to be giving your kid an iPad or whatever it is anyway, right? There's educational materials. I mean, in another era, the kids would just be like abandoned to play on their own and maybe like die of dysentery or something.
Sure.
By the way, huge medical advances in technology, even over the last 20 years, helped by some of these companies, not exactly the social media companies, and blind people can get eyes that they can see, deaf people can hear again because of technological advance that could be killed early if we had major regulation of these companies. But again, many of these approaches, the nationalist conservative movement wants to do this all with the federal government, which is, didn't it used to be a conservative belief that we should let local communities experiment with their policies, and if their policies are better, maybe this other community develops them. We don't want to tell these people how to live. We might have a different set of values, and now it's this just rush to win control of the federal government so we can force our way of life on everyone. I object to that when the left does that. That's what the progressives want to do. Certainly, make everyone bake cakes, etc. I'm very concerned that the right in this moment is like, yep, we're going to do that. We're going to win, and then we're going to make everyone do what we want. And of course, in the long term, that looks very suspect strategy.
Well, thank you for joining us, Ravi. It's an important aspect to get in this debate, and I appreciate you coming.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Next on Rising, are members of the GOP fleeing Congress, and who is qualified for the September debates?
Plus, the so-called erasing of Barack Obama's legacy. Team Rising shares their takes next.